This video was brought to you by Ground News. In normal times, monetary policy can be pretty boring, and the man on the Clapham omnibus isn't usually fussed about whether interest rates are going up or down, or who the next Fed chair is going to be. But these aren't normal times, and the escalating showdown between President Donald Trump and incumbent Fed Chair Jerome Powell, with the former threatening to fire the latter, and the latter insisting that they'd refuse to step down, has turned into a public drama that threatens to fatally undermine both the Federal Reserve's independence and international trust in the US dollar. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at why Trump wants to fire Powell, whether he actually can, and what might happen if he did. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, to understand this story, you need to understand what central bank independence actually is and why it's important. In short, central bank independence describes the extent to which a central bank can decide monetary policy, which mainly involves setting interest rates to control inflation without political or governmental interference. Now today, most economists agree that central bank independence is a good thing, because generally politicians are too keen to cut interest rates. That's because doing so stimulates economic growth in the short term, but risks stoking inflation in the medium to long term. This bias towards lower rates means that when politicians control monetary policy, they have a bit of a habit of pushing inflation up to dangerously and ultimately destabilizing levels, which is why economists generally prefer independent central banks. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Trump doesn't like this state of affairs, and has always been more vocally critical of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, than his recent predecessors. In his first term, Trump broke with convention by refusing to reappoint Obama's Fed chair Janet Yellen and replaced her with now incumbent chair Jerome Powell. Despite having appointed Powell, Trump immediately started pressuring him to cut rates, describing him as insane and an enemy when in early 2019 Powell refused. And in July 2019, there were even rumors that Trump was trying to get rid of Powell. Responding to these reports, Powell told Congress that he wouldn't resign even if Trump asked him to, and cited the Federal Reserve Act, which states that Fed chairs can only be removed by the president for cause, with legal scholars generally interpreting cause to mean serious misconduct or abuse of power. And we saw a very similar showdown earlier this year when Trump and his allies once again took to the airwaves to attack Powell and demand that he lowered rates. However, once again, Powell didn't seem too fussed, and in February he told a Senate committee that the Fed was not in a hurry to cut rates, arguing that while cuts might help offset the increasing risk of recession, they would increase the risk of above-target inflation, which was already elevated thanks to Trump's tariffs. In a sense, these episodes actually emphasized the Fed's independence, because Powell showed everyone that he could and would disobey Trump, which is why the markets didn't react too negatively. However, in the past week or so, Trump has stepped things up a notch and is now publicly pushing for Powell's resignation. The recent outburst seems to have been triggered by a speech Powell gave at the Economic Club of Chicago last Wednesday, when he again implied that the Fed didn't want to cut rates because of the inflationary risks associated with Trump's tariffs. The very next day, Trump posted on Truth Social that Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. Talking to reporters in the White House on the same day, Trump insisted that if I want him out, he'll be out of there. And the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump was considering replacing him with Kevin Warsh, a financier and former Fed governor. Then on Friday, Trump's National Economic Council director, Kevin Hassett, told reporters that the president was studying whether he was legally allowed to fire Powell. And on Monday, Trump put out another Truth Social calling for, quote, preemptive cuts, i.e. cuts ahead of the next scheduled Fed meeting, which is due on May 7th, and attacking Powell as a, quote, major loser. Unlike last time, however, Trump's attacks on Powell have spooked the markets, with the S&P 500 falling by nearly 3% on Monday, and the dollar dropping to a 2-year low against the euro. This is presumably because, while last time Trump's attacks on the Fed ended up re-emphasizing its independence, because Powell successfully resisted them, this time it really does look like Trump might force Powell out. While it's true that the Federal Reserve Act says that the president can only fire the Fed chair for cause, it's not really clear how good a reason Trump actually needs, because no Fed chair has ever been removed by a president, so there's no clear precedent. The markets are apparently anxious that Trump might just fire him with some half-baked reason, then hope that either the Supreme Court rules in his favour, or he can pressure them into letting him get away with it anyway. And if this were to happen, it could be disastrous for the US economy. Most obviously, there'll be severe inflationary risks, given that Trump apparently wants to cut rates, despite the inflationary pressure of both tariffs and an ever-weakening dollar. This would all be exacerbated by a rise in inflation expectations. In other words, Americans will presumably expect inflation to rise under a Trump-controlled Fed, which would make businesses more likely to preemptively raise prices and workers more likely to preemptively demand higher wages. In this way, high inflation expectations can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to higher actual inflation, which is why independent central banks and the credibility that comes with them are so useful. And there are echoes here of what happened in Turkey a few years ago, when President Erdogan forced the central bank to cut rates despite high and rising inflation, firing and replacing any central banker who refused. This triggered a multi-year inflationary crisis, with inflation averaging about 60% between 2022 and 2024. To make matters even worse, this would almost definitely undermine the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. In short, foreign investors like holding dollars because they trust the Fed to keep inflation low, which essentially guarantees that the dollar is going to hold its value over time. So if Trump were to assert control over the Fed, there would be a real risk of a mass sell-off, as investors shift away from the dollar to prevent the value of their holdings being eroded by Trump-induced inflation. This would both accelerate a pre-existing decline of the dollar and exacerbate any inflationary crisis, because the dollar's weakening would make imports more expensive to consumers. In this sense, America is more vulnerable than even Turkey was. After all, it's not like the Turkish lira was widely held internationally before the crisis, which means that there was only so much space for a sell-off. But if foreign investors start dumping dollars en masse, and the Federal Reserve is too mired in crisis to step in and save the day, we truly could be in uncharted territory. There's a lot to unpack here though, with this story reported on by more than 166 sources. Interestingly, we can see that of those, 21% came from left-leaning outlets, while 24% came from outlets that lean right. Looking at the headlines, you can see some differences too, with left-leaning outlets broadly blaming Trump, and right-leaning outlets paying more attention to Powell's apparent shortcomings. We're able to do that because of our sponsor, Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from around the world, and then organizes them each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting, where those sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. So if you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan using the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.